Hello, and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm your host, Dr. Lee Kaplan. In this episode, I sit down with philosopher Zeyad el Nabolsy to discuss his article, The Concept of Western Civilization in Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson as an Ethnophilosopher. So together, we explore one of the most influential and debated texts in Black studies and political theory, Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism. Our conversation examines Robinson's conception of Western civilization as a transhistorical formation structured by racism, his account of the Black radical tradition, and his critique of Marxism. We discuss whether racism can be understood as a continuous essence running from classical antiquity to the modern world, the relationship between capitalism and racial domination, and the historical development of conceptions such as equality, human rights, slavery, and dehumanization. Along the way, we explore the Valladolid debate, Aristotle's theory of natural slavery, the Haitian Revolution, liberalism and its emancipatory possibilities, the influence of Western intellectual traditions on anti-colonial thinkers such as C.L.R. James and Amilcar Cabral, and the methodological debates surrounding ethnophilosophy and African philosophy. We also consider Robin's treatment of Islam, Orientalism, and the broader question of how intellectual traditions travel, transform, and become tools for liberation in new historical contexts. If you enjoy these conversations, please subscribe, leave a review, or share the episode. And as always, thanks for listening. Hello, and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. Today, I'm joined by Zeyad el Nabolsy, who has a PhD in Africana Studies from the Cornell University. He has an MA in Philosophy and a B in Chemical Engineering from McMaster University. Zeyad is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at York University. His main area of focus is modern African intellectual history, and he's got a dissertation titled Science, Modernity, and Progress in 19th Century West and North Africa, a comparative study of Africanus Horton and Rifat al-Tawati. He seeks to answer the question, how does our understanding of the role of modern science in African societies change when we cease to ignore the early reception of some of the early modern scientists by 19th century African intellectuals such as Africanus Horton in West Africa and Rafat al-Tawi in North Africa prior to the scramble for Africa? All right, great. So today, and you've published many other things of which I'd love to also discuss, specifically your Amilcar Cabral piece as well. But anyway, besides that, today we're going to be talking about your piece, The Concept of Western Civilization in Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson as an Ethnophilosopher. So would you mind telling us sort of what you're laying out in this piece? I think a lot of folks might be familiar with the sort of argument that's going on, but nonetheless, you really sort of hammer home what's at stake, especially in the conclusion and what this means and kind of the issues within Cedric Robinson's formulation. And there's a bit of irony in some of these formulations as well. So if you wouldn't mind just laying out your argument and what's going on here, and we'll take it from there.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Lee, for having me here on your podcast. I'm looking forward to it. So, in terms of the argument, the way I read Cedric Robinson, and the way I think many people have read him, is that he's making the claim that, first of all, there is such a thing as a Black radical tradition. But what I take to be the more contentious claim is the claim that this tradition could not have drawn upon anything, any intellectual discourse that developed in Western societies, Western social formations, however we want to label them. So I don't take issue with the first claim. I think he's correct in identifying a tradition that he calls the Black radical tradition. I take issue with the second claim, the claim that in principle this tradition couldn't have drawn upon discourse that emerges in Western societies. And the second claim in Robinson's work is based on a more fundamental claim, which I take to be one of his key claims, namely that there is such a thing as Western civilization, such that there is some kind of unity that obtains when we look at societies all the way, let's say, from classical Athens to whatever contemporary Western European societies in North America, elsewhere. And the idea is that this continuity is based on some kind of intellectual continuity or some key intellectual principles that are not abandoned and that always remain hegemonic. And amongst these principles, the chief one at the level of political institutions and intellectual discourse is a form of racism. So Robinson is very clear that he thinks, racism is this disease that has afflicted Western societies all the way back to classical antiquity. It manifested itself in different ways, but it really goes all the way back to antiquity, survives into late antiquity, and into the medieval period, into the Renaissance, into the modern period. Basically, that's the scheme. And therefore, Robinson's claim is that capitalism, because it emerged first in Western societies, is marked by this feature of Western civilization, namely racism. Right? So, in a sense, to put it simplistically, it is the racism of Western civilization that explains Atlantic slavery. It's not something about the functioning of the capitalist mode of production or something like that.
That's great. Thank you so much. And yeah, it's another sort of, it's a lot of people talk about it as a sort of inversion of the Marxist kind of tradition or the Marxist thought, where it's sort of like racism comes first and then it's like capitalism involves with it. And then capitalism is like sort of an expression of racism in different ways. And he also sort of makes this claim sometimes that like capitalism could have only emerged with a sort of racism prior to it. And I noticed that like a lot of the work you sort of get into starts thinking about the ways in which his analysis kind of misses a lot of these different social political factions and factors of economic development. And it specifically seems like because he's responding to what he sees as the pure reduction of Marxism to economism, that he then sort of like switches it to then focus mainly on a cultural entity that is transient throughout time. And it's sort of like becomes like racism becomes like a Kantian sort of like category insofar as like it's a transhistorical factor that sort of like conditions the possibility of a Western society. Now, that being said, can you talk about some of the issues with this sort of claim in your view, or others' views as well?
Sorry, if I can ask you to repeat that part. I think you're cutting off for me. I don't know if it's my internet connection or yours. Hopefully, our internet connection is
Sure.
fine.
Yeah, not a problem.
Yeah,
No, no,
yeah,
no,
this
not a
is good.
problem.
Yeah.
Okay, great, great. Okay, so yeah, I was just kind of curious about the issues that come across with this underlying sense of kind of racism, then capitalism sort of thing, or whether or not these questions kind of make sense, or some of the responses that people have had to this sort of stuff and how you see it.
Yeah, yeah. So I think of course there are many different definitions of racism, right? So I mean if we say that a form of ethnocentrism and a contempt for strangers is sufficient for racism or just is racism, then of course, racism has existed throughout human history. In many languages, uh, the name that people give themselves as a group usually means the humans or the people, right? It's very ethnocentric and so on, right? So in that sense, you could say, well, look, racism is this transhistorical phenomenon in this weak sense. But then there's another way to talk about racism, which is to say that racism is not just contempt for strangers or others or thinking that they're inferior, but also it's an ideological discourse that seeks to justify the position that they occupy in a hierarchical division of labor, right? And that way you get into a more specific discourse. And then you could say, well, look, for example, uh, the way that Aristotle talks about non-Greeks as natural slaves in his Politics, in his book The Politics, does express a kind of racist discourse because most slaves in the slave societies of antiquity were non-Greeks. And I mean, I think, this is a point that I concede to Robinson actually in the paper, and I've written a paper on Aristotle's theory of natural slavery in its historical context. So again, I think, you can talk about racism there. But then of course, there are periods where racism, in that sense, in the sense of an ideological discourse tethered to the justification uh, of the way in which certain people occupy a certain position in a hierarchical division of labor, there are periods, of course, in Western history where you don't see racism being that salient. It's not clear that it was that salient in the Middle Ages, for example. I mean, there is dispute, of course, we can have a debate about this, uh, but that's all to say that it's very hard to just read or project Aristotle's theory of natural slavery across the entirety of Western history. In fact, it doesn't really play a role in the ancient world after Aristotle, interestingly enough, even though these are slave societies. The Roman Empire is a slave society, uh, but appeals to theories of natural slavery are really not that important. Of course, it gets revived in the early modern period, in the Bajadolid debate. But that's a specific historical context, and we can't ignore the kind of intervening time between these two events, right?
Yeah, that's great. And that sort of gets at one of the issues you have with his concern of Western civilization being a transhistorical phenomena that always contains an internal essence, and this essence being sort of racism. And this idea that you talk about of sort of racism meaning different things at different times, specifically in the context of kind of Aristotle versus modern rights discourse. And so the reason you write that the reason why Aristotle has to be privileged is because that is the thing that grants this continuity of this internal essence. And without this internal essence, the argument sort of falls apart. Because if racism is a thing that's different at different times, it's not a structuring element of Western society. It's more so, rather than in the base, a structuring element, it's more so within the superstructural element in different ways, right? So it seems like I'm not sure what you'll think about this, but I'm kind of wondering then if this is even an argument or a sort of thought to make that if is racism within the superstructure, is it within the basis or within the base of it? Because it seems like for Robinson, race is within the foundational elements of a structuring of society, and then capitalism grows out of it, which is another flipping of his.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So I didn't think when I wrote that paper, I don't think I was trying to enter into a debate whether racism belongs to the superstructure or to the base. And in fact, I would say, of course, in the American South in the 19th century, it obviously belongs to the base. It's a way in which relations of production are ordered. I think this is pretty clear. And of course, it has resonances in, the kind of cultural slash intellectual slash ideological discourse of the time. But actually, to go back to your question, I would even make a stronger claim in the sense that I would say that racism has not always been a salient element in Western social structures. Not that it has just manifested itself in different ways, which it has, but in some cases it was just not that salient. And I think that constitutes an important break in Robinson's narrative. And the other thing I would note is one of the issues I highlight in the paper is, of course, that there is a big gap and a big discontinuity between the way that ancient Greek political theorists talked and the way that early modern political theorists talked, right? So if you take somebody like Aristotle, Aristotle, of course, has some kind of notion of equality, but it's equality between male citizens of the polis, right? And so your particular social and political ties, your citizenship status, that's key for talking about your status as an equal. Whereas if you look at some of this early modern rights discourse, for example, in John Locke, there is this notion of equality in a state of nature, which for Aristotle really wouldn't make much sense because he takes it for granted that there are hierarchies in nature, that this is just obvious, and that this is a way to legitimate, of course, social and political hierarchies. So I think there is a very important discontinuity here. And this is why I would say, and I give examples of this in the paper, right? If you look, for example, at the discourse of the Haitian Revolution, there is this appeal to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, right? And saying, well, look, we're humans, so why are we not accorded these rights? In an ancient context, that wouldn't have made any sense at all, right? There was just there was no notion of equality, this strong notion of equality, just by virtue of being a human being. That just was not very salient. So I think that's an important discontinuity as well.
Yeah, for sure. And within the answer you just gave as well is another contention you have, which is Toussaint Louverture and other sort of revolutionary figures within aspects of kind of decolonial struggles or the global South. He's making the claim that these figures did not or could not have kind of come from the Western tradition because the Western tradition and Western intellectual history is nothing but sort of racism coming about in different ways and rearing its head. And he's saying that nothing can come from this, nothing liberatory can come from this because it's always contaminated. And so this doesn't sort of make sense when you look at the history of a lot of sort of Black revolutionaries and kind of even different sort of Islamic revolutions and, drawing from different traditions. And this gets at kind of the issue of just reducing figures like Marxist thinkers and Marxism to just a Western tradition and Western canonical thinkers.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Robinson says pretty explicitly that people like C.L.R. James are wrong to think that bourgeois emancipatory discourse was relevant at all for people in the third world. I think he uses that terminology. Yeah. Uh, um, and I think the historical record shows that this is simply false, right? I mean, you have all of these intellectuals like Julius Nyerere, who's influenced by Fabian socialism, pretty obviously. You have Kwame Nkrumah, who's influenced by Marxism. You have Senghor, who's influenced by non-Marxist forms of socialism in France. You have Amilcar Cabral, who's obviously influenced by Marxism, but also setting aside Marxism, they're also influenced by this liberal discourse of human rights, right? So Cabral talks about human rights. He talks about a right to national self-determination. Now you could say, well, look, this is, uh, not really a liberal right. Maybe that's true, but of course it emerges in a kind of 19th century milieu where there is this debate about the place of nationalism in liberal discourse. So I think the historical record really doesn't bear out Robinson's contention. And in fact, if we have to look for African thinkers and political leaders who were only influenced by African ideas, we're going to be really circumscribing the scope of uh, 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 African intellectual history and African political history in a very arbitrary way, I would say.
Right, of course, because there's always, these sort of movements and shipments and whatnot. So this is kind of one of the things that happens when you don't look at kind of modes of production and exchange. You're assuming that people don't have contact with one another, which is kind of a confusing thing, and also has to do with the idea and the invention of what Africa is and what it looks like, which is kind of the Mubembe thing as well. Like, is an African philosophy possible? What does that mean? What does that look like kind of thing?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
what I was thinking, what makes sort of the liberal rights or modern natural rights discourse kind of like radical is when it actually happens.
Right, right. And that's also, it's important to note that, the extension of scope of these rights, uh, it's a product of political and social struggle, right? Nobody's saying that, well, just people had these ideas and they discovered, well, actually, we have to subsume more people under these categories. No, of course. I mean, liberalism historically, just as a matter of historical fact, it precedes the democratic liberalism, right? So there was first liberalism and then liberal democracy, and liberal democratic discourse is a later occurrence as a result of these social struggles to expand the franchise, whether along the lines of gender or class or race, right? So I think it's important not to deny that and not to give to liberal political philosophy more than its due. But the whole point is to say that within liberal political philosophy, there was room for people to use certain concepts to articulate their interests, to articulate their demand. And really, the key point here is to say that we should never think that, people in the West have some kind of monopoly on discourse that first emerges in the West. I mean, look, you could develop a theory, but it doesn't mean that you're best placed to understand it or understand its implications. So I think anxieties about borrowing from other societies and so on, well, they're very understandable. They really do constrain you in your political and social actions, in your political and social planning, and they constrain you in a way that's not really, I think, useful. And this is why, you had somebody like Amilcar Cabral, who's, he's an agricultural engineer. So he's a bit of a pragmatist about these things. He says, look, we're not going to have all of these discussions about whether this is uniquely African or not uniquely African. We're going to talk about whether this is useful for our political and social goals or not useful. And if it's useful, we'll use it. If it's not useful, we'll discard it. So again, very, you could say this is overly simplistic, and perhaps it is, but I think it gives you a touchstone so that you don't get, dragged into all of these debates about origin and so on.
Right, of course, because a lot of times over intellectualizing could get in the way of practical sort of implementations of different revolutionary programs and whatnot, or just programs in general. Like what comes to mind is sort of like Lenin's introduction to State and Revolution. He's like, I haven't written anything in a while because I was participating in the revolution or something like this, you know?
Right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think maybe over intellectualizing, but also another way to think about this is really if what's happening is you're also uh you know assuming that discourse that emerges elsewhere is not something that you can ever make use of because those people have a monopoly on it. And I think, of course, there is a way in which people talk about, well, maybe if you're Italian, you talk about an Italian heritage. But of course, there is a version of this that's totally silly, right? So, for example, if I tell you by virtue of being Italian, I have a better grasp of Galileo's mechanics than other people. I mean, this is just, I mean, it sounds very silly. Uh, but something similar, I think, would be said with respect to socio-political ideals as well. Ideals and ideas, if you will. Yeah.
Right, that's really interesting. It's like this inaccessible sort of epistemological core that can only happen if you are within a certain type of body or something like this. It's not about socialization, it's not about history as a process. It's sort of like you're born this way, you think this way kind of thing.
Right, right.
So, there's so many different points to get at here because your article is very rich in its discussions and matters. I'm kind of curious if you want to bring this to the issues with dehumanization and kind of the idea of dehumanization when it occurred, and then I also want to get into kind of the moment where you talk about Islam within Cedric Robinson as well. But we could start with dehumanization.
Good. Okay. Yeah. So I present this as a hypothesis in the paper. I think it needs more work. Maybe I'm too lazy to end up working this out extensively. But I think people are right to point that in the modern period, uh, enslavement is associated with dehumanization. I think this is very clear. I think they're totally right to say that. However, and this is the more controversial aspect of what I'm saying, I'm not really sure that dehumanization, at least conceptually speaking, right? Because you could say, well, look, okay, conceptually speaking, it might be the case, but psychologically, it's a bit different, in terms of our empirical psychology. Yeah, fair. But I would say that conceptually speaking, there is nothing, in Aristotle's theory of natural slavery that compels him to dehumanize the enslaved. I mean, he says they're fully human. I mean, they actually, I mean, he says they partake in reason. Of course, they don't have practical wisdom, but he says they're human. He doesn't really deny that they're humans. And this might be, a kind of point of instability in Aristotle's own theory, actually. But my main point in the paper was that if you think that there are rights that you have just by virtue of being a human being, I don't really know anything about you. I just know what species of animal you belong to. You're a human animal. You belong to the species. I don't know what polis you're from. I don't know your level of education, your level of wealth, whatever. But you still have rights just by virtue of being a human. It's not really clear to me that in the ancient Greek world, people would have talked this way, at least, in the classical period. And to that extent, if you don't have that notion that you have certain rights by virtue of being a human, you might think, well, I don't have to dehumanize you to enslave you. And you might think, for example, that in medieval Islamic slavery at the conceptual level, there was no requirement to dehumanize the enslaved. They might, the enslaved might be treated in a cruel manner and all of that, but conceptually speaking, you're not really required to dehumanize them. However, once you have this modern notion of human rights, that these are rights that you have just by virtue of you being a human being, you have a problem. Because if you enslave someone and you claim that they're human, but this human being has a right to liberty, a right to private property, and so on. Now, if you're still committed to the claim that this entity is a human being, then you're going to land in contradictions, right? Because on the one hand, they're humans, and so they have these rights, right to liberty and so on. But on the other hand, they are enslaved in actuality, right? So they don't actually have that right to liberty. So one solution that you have is to say, well, look, these are not really, these entities that look like humans, seem to behave like humans, are not really fully humans. And this kind of move will find, I think, its fullest development in the 19th century when people start saying, so people especially associated with the Anthropological Society of London in the mid 1860s, people like James Hunt will say, well, look, actually, Black Africans, they belong to a different species. We're not even members of the same species. And that's full dehumanizations, right? That's, you're denying that these people belong to the species Homo sapien. That's very clear what you're doing. But that's the only way you can get out of that contradiction of saying that people have these rights by virtue of being humans, but also some humans are going to be enslaved.
Yeah, I thought that was a super interesting part where it's sort of like the figure of the human takes on and has different, like, what's axiomatic qualities or something like this, rather than needing to dehumanize because everyone's considered human. Like, what comes to mind is kind of two things in the ancient tradition, ancient Greek tradition, where it's the Socrates and Meno story, where he gives the slave is able to solve equations using, the sand and whatnot. So you have slaves able to have the capacity to reason, and reason becomes later this thing that becomes racialized in different ways. Like mind body sort of racialization duality is going on. And then you have Epictetus as well, who's also a slave as well, and teaches the king or whoever it was, or his master's son, to kind of read and to do different like arithmetic stuff. So slaves have human qualities, or rather are humans. There's no separation within this ancient world, and a lot of these kind of stories bear this out in different ways.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the only qualification is I would concede that Aristotle thinks that there is something lacking in the ability of slaves to engage in practical reasoning. Uh, right? He says that. But he himself is not very clear on what exactly they lack. But the Stoic example is interesting because it's with Stoicism, which is, a much later development in the Hellenistic period, where you see a kind of discourse that talks about human brotherhood and so on, right? And, that we're all citizens of, we're all citizens of the world, right? We're not tethered to a particular polis, which is very different from Aristotle's own outlook. Even though Aristotle is kind of living in the dying embers of the city-state, basically, right? He's Alexander's tutor and so on. So I think that's an important difference. Um, But I think my point would be to say that it's not clear that in the ancient world you would have had these rights that we talk about today as human rights just by virtue of being a human, as opposed to by virtue of being, a male citizen of the polis who meets certain property qualifications, for example. Yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for the clarification. So there's two places where these arguments seem incredibly clear and historically prescient that you write about, which is the ways in which the Southern planter class within the United States during slavery utilized and had to distinguish between these two different arguments, and also the Valladolid debate as well. So would you mind kind of talking about these two different things and what's at stake within these?
Yes, of course. So maybe we can take them in chronological sequence. So of course the Spaniards, they, between quotes, discover the Americas. And of course there is an indigenous population there, indigenous peoples who live in different social formations. Some of them have essentially centralized empires with clear, class structures, with a very complex division of labor. Some of them are simpler societies. Um, and of course, there is a question of what to do with these people, especially because the conquistadors, who, a lot of them went there uh, in pursuit of wealth. Maybe some of them were driven by religious convictions, but a lot of them, thought, okay, if we do this, we have to get some material gain. So there was a debate about, how to treat the conquered, the conquered indigenous people. The Spanish, of course, talked about them as Indios. So there is a debate in the Spanish town of Valladolid. I mean, I know the name in Arabic, it's Balad el Walid, but I think in Spanish it's Valladolid. Uh, a debate between people who hold the view that actually these people are natural slaves, therefore they deserve to be enslaved. Because if you recall, for Aristotle, a natural slave is someone, or an entity or a being, whatever, uh, uh, whom it is normatively justified to enslave. Right? You're totally right to enslave that person, that natural slave. And in fact, enslavement is better for that person because they cannot direct their own lives, right? So the question is whether, the Indios, to use the Spanish term, are natural slaves. And then you have the opposing side, led by Las Casas, who holds that they are not, in fact, natural slaves. Now, in the way that some people have written about this debate, there is a question of dehumanization and humanization, right? So Louis Hanke, who writes two books on this, I think in the 50s, 60s in English. Um, in Hanke's books, it's not clear what's the relationship between dehumanization and the question of whether they are natural slaves. But I would argue that this is also the period where it makes sense that there would be this lack of clarity. Because you could think of it as a period where also the notion of being a human is taking on these axiological connotations that maybe it didn't have in other societies. So for Aristotle, the question of whether they are natural slaves or not would have been independent of the question of whether they belong to the human species or not. But at least as Hanke describes it in the Valladolid debate, these two things, they get kind of conflated, right? So whether they are natural slaves or not is now kind of tethered to the question of whether they are humans or not. So I'm not a specialist in that debate, but it seems that there is some conflation here, at least in the way it's been presented in some of the scholarship. That's one. So going to the second revival, if you will, of Aristotle's theory of natural slavery, this happens in the 19th century with the American planter class and their ideological supporters. And very interesting, it's very interesting to note that their ideological supporters essentially say, well, look, if you really want to justify slavery, you have to give up this modern rights discourse. We have to abandon social contract theory. It's not working because it's also not very clear that we can, maintain the claim that, all humans have a right to liberty by virtue of being humans, but also some of them are going to be enslaved. That just seems to be a contradiction. So the radical solution is to actually abandon modern rights discourse and repudiate the American Constitution, to say this is nonsense. There is no equality in nature, or no equality between humans and nature. There is a hierarchy in nature. And this hierarchy is best described using ancient Greek political philosophy, in particular using the writings of Aristotle in the Politics. And they say that pretty explicitly. Because then they say, well, look, Aristotle gives us an account of natural slaves and natural masters, if you will. I mean, he doesn't really say natural masters, but you can kind of think about it this way. And they say, well, okay, we take this account and all we need to do is overlay it with the distinction between white masters and black slaves. And they'll say, well, look, Aristotle, when he's talking about natural slaves, he's maybe talking about people from the northern parts of the Black Sea and maybe parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. That's fine. We're just going to rejig it a little bit so it talks about, so that the account is applicable to a majority black population in the American South, enslaved population, that is.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for going through all of that history and kind of the contentions between the two. And obviously, this problematizes kind of the transhistorical notion of racism, because if people are debating what racism is and what it looks like and having to justify slavery on various grounds, this means that there's no sort of hegemonic, complete understanding of the Western tradition. There are various facets and ruptures and breaks, and these are things that kind of Robinson can't.
Yeah, well, and actually, I would emphasize that the fact that the ideologues of slavery in the American South felt compelled to abandon modern rights discourse and to kind of repudiate Locke and Locke's descendants explicitly tells us something interesting about the emancipatory potential of modern rights discourse. The fact that they had to go back to Aristotle, I think I would highlight that as something important to think about.
No, that's great. It's super interesting to think about like potentials of liberatory within like the liberal tradition, or sort of what that looks like. One thing that you talk about is basically the ways in which what is it? The questions that Robinson didn't ask. So you talk about why Robinson felt the need when he was looking at certain societies. Uh, it's like sort of, we all know that this modern rights discourse of equality sort of didn't happen, still isn't happening, right? There are people that are less than, people that are not considered human in the same way, or there's a value system of humans. So the question is sort of, rather than contend with whether or not this is true, why does a society that knows it values certain lives more than others, why does it feel the need to create a type of liberal philosophy that obscures reality?
Yeah. I think that's a really important question. I mean, I don't think I have a fully worked out answer to it, but I have a justification for why we should pose that question. Because if you look, I mean, as I say in the paper, of course, there are lots of societies without equality in human history, societies with serfs, societies with all sorts of things going on. But not all societies have had a myth of equality. Right? There is no myth of equality, for example, in ancient Egyptian society, where there is obviously a clear hierarchy between the king and the king's household and the peasantry, right? But there is no myth of equality in ancient Egyptian intellectual discourse, or, there is no myth of equality in classical Maya discourse, as far as I know. So the question we should ask is, well, why is there a myth of equality in these liberal societies, right? Uh, is that something that's maybe necessary for the capitalist mode of production? Because the way it operates, at least ideally, is it's supposed to be getting rid of personal dependency, right? You're no longer working for the Lord because the Lord has a claim on your time. You're working because if you don't work, if you don't freely enter into a contract to sell your labor power, you're going to starve. but you have to freely enter into it, in principle, at least, right? The Lord can say, well, look, I'm your Lord. I've inherited my position by virtue of my father, and you guys just have to work 2 days a week in my household. And Marx himself, not my household, sorry, in my own property, in the manorial property. And Marx himself points this out as something interesting because he says, look, under serfdom, exploitation existed, but it was very transparent, right? If you and I were serfs, and let's say, our arrangement required that for, each week we have to work 1 day on the Lord's land without wages. It's very clear, okay, that, we have to work for this Lord and so on. But Marx points out that, the interesting thing about liberal capitalist societies is that exploitation is masked, right? It's masked in the sense that there is no one who's your actual Lord, right? And in fact, exploitation seems to be intensified even when you can get people to think that they are their own boss. So think of all of this gig economy stuff, right? I mean, this was the kind of promise of the gig economy stuff that, look, you're going to be driving an Uber, you work whenever you want. You're not clocking in at 9 a.m. and you have to leave at 5 p.m., right? You have this freedom and so on. You're not, dependent on, your boss or something in a direct way. But of course, it ends up also being a case where you, as the driver in this case, you're being subjected to exploitation.
Yeah, no. I mean, definitely, sort of capitalism can mystify the mode of production with fetishization and all of the other things, right? And Lenin also talks about sort of something similar. He's got this really interesting sentence in like State and Revolution again. I don't know why this text is on my mind. I haven't read it in a bit, but anyway, he has this sort of notion that like democratic electoralism and electoral politics serves sort of as this great kernel for seeming freedom but not freedom, right? So it's the idea of being your own boss, but not looking at distributive processes and kind of where you are in this chain and how you're basically kind of your own boss, and your self-exploitation and burnout society, Byung-Chul Han kind of stuff as well. Um, but I was where was I kind of going? I was curious about also something that Cedric Robinson takes issue with. Is this idea of critique from the inside or interior and external critique, specifically where Marx is responding to Hegel in some ways. So would you mind talking about kind of these issues? And then also it basically from there, you go to the issues with kind of the criterion of thought, kind of like the normative and the judgments of normative, like who makes these claims sort of thing. I think you call it the dilemma of criterion. So if you wouldn't mind kind of talking about those two things.
Sure, yeah. So one of Robinson's key criticisms of Marx and Engels, as far as I can make it out, is that while they provide a kind of internal critique of capitalist society, they take it on its own terms and criticize it on that basis, right? So they take the society as making promises about personal freedom and so on, and then they show how it cannot really keep these promises for the vast majority of people, right? And he takes issue with that because it's not a sufficiently radical break with that society. And, my response to that, well, it's twofold, right? The first one is to say, well, look, yes, they're engaged in an imminent critique or internal critique, and they know that this is what they're doing. They say this explicitly. And that there are historical reasons that make sense of this move. So Marx and Engels, they inherit from Hegel the idea of the importance of internal critique, which is basically, internal critique is, let's say, Lee, you make a claim and you say this is the adequate standard of justification. I try to show you that based on the standard of justification or standard of evidence that you purport to uphold that your claim is false. I don't bring in another standard and say, well, no, this is actually more adequate, because then we're gonna have a debate about which standard is more adequate, and then there is a question of, well, how do we justify the appeal to these standards, right? So it's a kind of way to avoid this skeptical problem, basically, which is a problem, that's articulated, clearly all the way back in uh, Pyrrhonian skepticism with Sextus Empiricus, right? Who presents this dilemma of the criterion. But anyway, we can set that aside. So Marx and Engels are inheriting this problem from Hegel, and so they're using immanent critique as a solution to sidestep this problem, to say, well, look, we're going to take this society on its own terms and show that on its own terms it doesn't achieve what it says it will achieve, right? So it seems to be actually an even more powerful critique than somebody coming and saying, well, look, what about these other values? Because of course your interlocutor can say, well, look, what justifies this other set of values? And then we have a meta debate about the criterion we're using. Okay. The other aspect, I think, is, and this is, I think, a contentious issue, even though, I think in a kind of orthodox Marxist discourse, it's pretty obvious. Namely that Marx and Engels, they think that capitalism is a historically progressive development in human history. I think it's very transparent that they think that, even taking into account the kind of revisionist scholarship that emphasizes Marx's ethnological notebooks and so on. But I think it's pretty clear that they think that capitalism is superior to feudalism, which is how they think of the stage of European history that precedes capitalism, right, chronologically. And for most of the 20th century, I would say most Marxists across the world took it for granted that capitalism is a capitalism and its attendant ideological discourse of liberal political philosophy, that these are progressive developments in human history. Now, they don't achieve what they say they will achieve, therefore we have to go beyond them and try to go beyond them, but we're not repudiating them entirely. Right, so I think that's kind of one of the main points of disagreement. And you see today, actually, in the way some people will talk about liberalism as if it's all kind of a ruse. It's not really, it was never an important development in human history, which, I would personally contend that this is false, and the evidence shows that this is false. Of course, people have appealed to liberal principles to justify attacks on patriarchal authority, whether that be the authority of the patriarch over the young men of the household or over women in general, both young and old. So I think it would be very odd. And since you've brought up Lenin so much, Lenin himself says this pretty clearly when he's talking about liberalism and its effects in Russia in the late 19th century. He says that, of course, it's a good thing to break the power of the patriarch. It's a great thing, in fact, and it would be absurd to maintain otherwise.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for that. And there's a lot of different stuff to sort of like touch on and threads to pull at too. You talked about kind of like what counts as evidence. You were hinting at what different types of evidence, and this is maybe a little bit kind of tangential. It probably is, but I was watching like just some random documentary, and it was like, a murder took place in Scotland, and it was just like the amount of evidence they needed to pin the crime on somebody. It was just like it kept going in different ways. It was sort of like they had the weapon, they found the body, and they found the person, and they were like, we still need to figure out how to take him to court or something. So there's different sort of normative judgments, and these normative judgments have real political stakes in terms of like what locking someone up or not locking someone looks like. Like these sorts of normative claims have kind of like stuff going on with like different forms of abolition and what that might look like as well. So they're not just sort of like different kind of like what there's a lot more at stake rather than just kind of like a simple argument here.
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of step back and give a kind of bird's eye view of the paper. My primary contention was not really, with Robinson per se, to be frank. It was with the uncritical way in which Robinson has been taken up in some circles. right? Because I think if people were serious about launching a research program, we would then have to have a discussion about, whether racism is a transhistorical phenomenon in Western society. What do we mean by racism? Right. So we would have to really examine some of these key claims and scrutinize them in a critical way. I mean, I think Robinson is wrong, but I mean, I don't think he takes responsibility for the fact that people who have followed him haven't critically examined his key claims and tried to keep what was well justified and jettison or abandon the elements that are not well justified. So I think that the paper is obviously directed against Robinson, but it's in a more real way, if you will. It's directed against the uncritical way in which people have taken up that project and that book, right? Because I do think that there are important things in that book, but it doesn't mean that we should uncritically accept everything in that book, which sounds very banal to say, but I think it's something that really people should take into consideration and take more seriously if they want to seriously move this project forward. And they really, I think, because I think the study of something that we can describe as the Black radical tradition is totally independent of the claim that there is the transhistorical Western civilization against which that Black tradition is to be defined.
Yes, that's something I wanted to sort of also kind of make very clear is that just because the ways in which he positions a Black radical tradition, and we might be sort of pushing back on how he makes that, it doesn't negate the fact that there is and always will be and always has been this Black radical tradition. It's just the way he sort of defines what that might look like, because he says that the Black radical tradition is the negation of sort of like Western intellectual thought, which precludes the possibility of many revolutions and thinkers that have already occurred. So when you look at sort of thinkers within the Black radical tradition, by sort of Robinson's definition, it makes it impossible for them to even exist in many ways. So
Yes.
just wanted to make that kind of abundantly clear. Like, we're not pushing back on the Black radical tradition, but rather the ways in which he positions its possibility.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, exactly. So, I mean, take somebody like CLR James, who most people would place in the Black radical tradition. I mean, James's main inspiration is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He says that pretty clearly. He thinks Rousseau is the most important thinker of the modern period. But then it would, I think, be very strange if we use that against CLR James to say, well, look, you don't belong in the Black radical tradition. And the other thing to highlight is, of course, to emphasize that some thinkers in the Black radical tradition drew upon Western thought. It doesn't mean that, they didn't draw upon uh, uh, ideas that were first developed, for example, in West Africa. So, if we're talking about the enslaved population of Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, of course, people bring with them, their own worldviews and so on. This is pretty obvious. Uh, and nor are we saying that, people needed to read John Locke or something to realize that enslavement is bad. The enslaved, they realize enslavement is bad on their own. They're not getting enough food. They don't have control over their lives. They don't need, a book to tell them that. But just the idea is that as a matter of historical fact, some of these ideas that they encountered were taken up and used in a way to push their own interests and their own political projects. I think that's all that's being said.
Yeah, that's great. And, different intellectual traditions are always repositioned based on where they're read and how they're implemented in different ways. So Fanon talked about sort of stretching Marxism and all these different things. Like, people use ideas for different purposes and places. This is something that kind of like we do. It happens all the time in music as well, different forms of composition, repurposing stuff like, within jazz. I mean, not to sort of bring in just too much music into this, but like within jazz music, people are always bringing in different traditions to rethink what music could sound like and be like, and it creates kind of different solidarity sonically as well. Um, so one thing, I guess that also is incredibly important to talk about is the other part of the title of your article, which is this word ethnophilosophy. And one of the other sort of claims that you rightfully make is kind of strange that Cedric Robinson isn't engaging with debates within the burgeoning field of kind of Africana philosophy. and what that is, what it studies, what counts as Africana philosophy. So, would you mind saying a little bit about kind of how he doesn't engage with that, or might in different ways, in problematic ways, or but also what
Okay, that question I think requires a longish answer, but I'll try to make it as short as possible. So, uh, people often date the rise of, academic philosophy on the African continent, or African academic philosophy to the mid 20th century. I mean, of course, I personally think African philosophy has been around since the ancient Egyptians at least. But anyway, that's a separate issue. We're talking about academic philosophy in a professional sphere and so on. Um, and people often point out the centrality of a book by a Belgian missionary called Placide Tempels, who writes this book called Bantu Philosophy. And this book was very well received by African philosophers and African intellectuals in the circle around the journal Présence Africaine in Paris, because it was seen as a refutation of the claim that Africans are too primitive to have a philosophy. Because philosophy is this rarefied intellectual discourse, so only advanced people can have it, right? Now, Placide Tempels in Bantu Philosophy, he tries to show that that the speakers of Bantu languages, and he's primarily doing his field work as a missionary in the Congo, but he generalizes. He talks about all speakers of Bantu languages in general, that they have an implicit philosophy based on a hierarchy of forces, and that these forces, according to them, interact in a law-like fashion, and that we can kind of articulate these laws. And now Temples notoriously says, well, these people, they cannot really themselves explicitly articulate their philosophy, but I'll do it on their behalf. So, based on Placide Temples' project, a lot of African philosophers started writing about Hausa philosophy, Yoruba philosophy, tethering philosophy, or talking about the philosophy of a particular ethnic group. Now, in response to this, a critique of this kind of philosophical discourse emerged by several people, but the most influential was by a philosopher from Benin called Paulin Hontonji, who's the person who labels these people as ethnophilosophers. So ethnophilosophy is an exonym. It's not a name that these people give to themselves. It's a name that a critic gives to them. And he says, the problem is these people are confusing two senses of philosophy. There is philosophy as a kind of worldview, and then there is philosophy as rigorous argumentation, the critical examination of starting points and first principles and so on. And he says they're conflating the two. So, in the weak sense of philosophy, everyone has a philosophy. Sporting coaches will talk about their philosophy before a game, right? They're using philosophy in a wider sense. But more importantly, Ontonji says the problem is that these people are assuming a kind of unanimity that only exists in their head. It's not really out there. It's not the case that all speakers of Bantu languages agree on what are the fundamental furnishings of the universe. In the same way that not all speakers of German or Germanic languages agree on key metaphysical principles, right? So, this is one of Hontonji's main criticisms. So this myth of unanimity becomes really important in the critique of ethnophilosophy. Now, Robinson, as we've been saying, he tends to, homogenize the philosophical discourse both of Europeans and Africans in a way that falls prey to this myth of unanimity. So this is what I wanted to say there. Now, one interesting thing is that Robinson seems to be using the work of an African philosopher, John M. Beatty, who wrote this book, African Religions and Philosophy. I think it came out in the late 60s, I want to say. Yeah. But of course, Mbiti's work has been subjected to a lot of criticism on methodological grounds in the 70s and 80s, and Robinson totally ignores that, right? So, this decade of the 70s, uh, so Robinson selectively uses certain um, writings belonging to the discipline of African philosophy or the field of African philosophy while ignoring responses to these claims.
It's interesting. When I was reading this piece, I think a lot of people probably also might think this as well, that there's a lot of sort of problems with essentialization and with sort of contemporary rise in identity politics as well, stemming from this kind of like intellectual project as well. So, because if he's saying sort of like only certain people of certain places and certain origins can have certain types of thoughts, um, he's falling into sort of a different essentialistic kind of category, which also could be used to bolster kind of like divisions and get rid of solidarities and get rid of types of thought that already exist and all of these sorts of things. I was just wondering if kind of connections between this sort of project and potential identity politics sort of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, look, so one way to understand what we're talking about when we talk about essentialization is to say, well, look, uh, if we're talking about intellectual discourse, I can say, well, look, for you to be African is for you to hold a belief of this kind, right? Like if you're not really holding a belief of this kind, well, you're not African or there is something wrong with your Africanness, because holding a belief of this kind is essential to being African. It's kind of what makes one an African, if you will. So if I tell you, holding that materialism as a metaphysical thesis, for example, is false, is essential to being African, then there is a way in which I'm really kicking out or pushing out all the Africans who want to embrace materialism or all the Africans who want to embrace individualism, right? So when people talk about African communalism, sometimes they fall into this trap of saying, well, actually, holding a communalist view of the relationship between the individual and the community, or the individual is, dependent on the community, or the community has priority over the individual, that this is essential to being African. But obviously, there are African liberal individualists. I mean, what are you going to do with these people? I mean, you cannot deny that they're African. And therefore, I think, you'd have to untether these identities from claims to, holding particular substantive philosophical beliefs.
Yeah, no, that's great. And one place where you sort of see these things fall apart different in different ways or clearly, or sort of what you describe as the limitations of his methodology is when he explores slavery within Islamic context and compares that
Mhm.
to Western slavery. So can you talk about that argument that you're making and some of the pitfalls within kind of his discourse?
Yeah, so I mean Robinson, because he wants to say that there is something specific and unique to racism in Western civilization. Uh, when he starts talking about slavery in the Islamic world in the medieval period, he starts talking about the way slavery is presented in ideological discourse from this period. So he quotes a hadith, which is a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. Um, and the saying is about treating slaves in a gentle manner and so on. I mean, I can't remember the details, but basically that's what it is, I think. uh and he kind of leaves his analysis of slavery in the Islamic world there, right? But then of course there is a very serious problem, because here you're comparing the ideals of one society to the socio-historical realities of slavery in another society. And it seems then there is something incommensurable here in terms of what you're trying to compare. You're not comparing an ideological discourse with another one, you're comparing a practice with an ideological discourse. It's as if I wanted to understand uh the position of the most marginalized people in the United States or something, and I try to understand it by reading what the New York Times says about them, or about American society, right?
Right.
I'll get a totally different picture. I'll get a very idealized picture that this is a society of equality, there is no discrimination, and so on.
Right. And then also part of the issue too that you kind of discuss is that Islamic societies, especially during the Golden Age. I don't know if you reference the Golden Age specifically, but they're deeply engaged with sort of forms of philosophy, specifically like Aristotle and Neoplatonism and whatnot. And this would kind of be impossible under Robinson's ideal version of kind of thinking through what philosophy is, because philosophy is something that only exists within particular geographical contexts, and so this makes thinking about Islamic philosophy as engaged with other projects in different areas not possible.
So, so I would have a slightly different reading of what Robinson is saying there, right? So I think Robinson is not saying that philosophy only happens in the West. I think he's saying that there is a philosophy that's unique to the West. There is a philosophy that's unique to Africans, right? But there is philosophy in both places, right? And so the Islamic stuff, I think the issue is he wants to explain why Aristotle's theory of natural slavery never took off in the Islamic world. And he tries to explain that by saying, well, look, in the Islamic world, they couldn't really take the authority of a pagan thinker seriously. And I try to show that obviously this is not true, because the authority of pagan thinkers was taken very seriously, especially Plato in the realm of political philosophy with people like Al-Farabi. But uh, more importantly, I would also say that the reason why Aristotle's theory of natural slavery doesn't get taken up in the Islamic world is because the politics is not translated into Arabic, right? So it's a very simple kind of mundane reason.
No, and then you also touch on really briefly how some of his ideas within Islam might also perpetuate different aspects of Orientalism by not engaging with certain thinkers and by only engaging with others, and not thinking about Islam as something that's changing and moving, and it's always like one sort of thing, and you can't discuss certain things, et
Mhm.
cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're totally right. And actually, the kind of excessive significance that he gives to religion, to Islam in particular, in explaining the nature of societies in the Islamic world, is, I think, one of the key features of Orientalism that resurfaces in his book.
Right. I guess well, that about does it for my questions. I know there's a million different ways we could go with this, but I think that's what I had prepared today in terms of questions. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close out?
No, I just want to thank you for hosting me and for your questions. I thought they were great questions. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. This was a lot of fun. And also, if you're interested, I'd love to talk to you about some of your other work as well. There's so much to dig into. I've been thinking about a lot of the stuff you've written about. So it'd be great to
Sure,
chat again.
of course, that'd be great.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you so much. Is there any place that listeners could kind of follow you and your work?
So I post most of my work on my Phil Papers profile because I'm too lazy to have a website. But if people just Google my name, Phil Papers, all of my papers are there. And of course, if there is something that's not there, people should feel free to email me.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'll link to that in the show notes.
Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good one.